So I'd like to just say a few more things about this essay. The last two sections, I guess, are sections 2 and 3, in which he has certain things to say. Section 2 is difficult. It's difficult for me because of the examples that he uses to illustrate his notion of death as a function. But I think that they're helpful if we don't press too hard on the details. He gives two analogous functions in science that he thinks will be helpful in the way that we conceive of death. The first has to do with Newton's first law of motion, and the second has to do, I think, the third law of thermodynamics. And I think what's important in each of those examples is this idea of something that we can conceive of, and that helps us to make sense of the world, but something that we could never actually experience, or maybe something that could never actually exist. First has to do with Newton's law of motions, and how can Newton's first law of motion help us to understand death? Well, the example there has to do with the idea of a body, of a physical body, upon which no force is being exerted. And if you think of gravitational force and the way that, according to Newton, all bodies in the universe act on each other proportional to the mass and the distance between them, an inverse proportion, then we can see that actually the idea of a body upon which no force is being exerted may be in experience impossible, but yet we can conceive of it. We can conceive of a body upon which no force is being exerted, and it could serve as a kind of a functional limit. If we think of less and less force being exerted on a body, then the limit would be the end of that process. It may never actually be reached in reality, but it's something that we can conceive of. The second example he gives is the idea of a body of a temperature of absolute zero, and again, that may be something that is impossible for an individual body to have no temperature, for no energy motion of its molecules whatsoever, but it's something we can think of a body approaching absolute zero. I guess his idea there is that, well, we can think of death having that kind of ordering function as well. That is, that we cannot actually experience our own deaths. There's very little that we can conceive of our own deaths, except that they are the limit of our lives. But our awareness of that limit helps us to sort of go about in the world. I mean, we understand that we are limited, and we will actually ultimately be limited by our own deaths. And that may make us slow down when we're driving too fast. It may make us do other things, our awareness of that temporal finitude. Now, I think that's what he's getting at there, is that if death is a limit that we never actually experience, it is also a limit that we are aware that in some sense we shall reach, and it gives a certain structure to our lives. Let's see if we can... for instance, what he says on page 174, he says, to say that death functions as a limit in this sense is simply to say that we build, to a considerable extent, our conceptual lives with the use of it. The general, usually unconscious realization that we are approaching the limit often impels us to, for example, truncate projects so that we can go on to others. It forces us to pick and choose those tasks from the multitude which are more worthwhile. In general, we form a set, that is, a context from which life is viewed via the realization that life is limited and that we are approaching the limit. All of this can be accomplished without any conception of an experienceless, literally thoughtless self whatsoever. That is, the notion, my awareness that I'm going to die is not an awareness that someday I will be in an endless sleep, or someday I will be in a state of permanent unconsciousness. No, he's saying that the awareness is that I will be nothing at all at a certain point, and I'm approaching that limit all the time. I am now a self, and someday I will be utterly annihilated as a self, and that will not be something I will actually experience, but my anticipation of reaching that limit makes me aware of the finitude of my own life. Um, I'd like to say just a couple more things. This is what he has to say about in section 3 of his essay, where he mentions two philosophers here, Schopenhauer and Epicurus. Now, Epicurus, I hope that you've read by now. I think that we can see that he is an Epicurean, that he's just trying to sort of fill out and elaborate on the basic insight that Epicurus offered, the notion that death is nothing to us because it's the end of all experience. He says something interesting with regard to this philosopher Schopenhauer, and I think that you can apply what he says to the third essay in this unit by Glenn Gray, The Idea of Death and Existentialism. He's sort of denying that we can really be aware of our death in any kind of substantive sense. We can be aware of approaching a limit, but that's all. He says something interesting in the beginning of section 3 on page 175. He says, excuse me, limits like death, that is, limits on our powers of conception, he says, are simply out of our league. We cannot grasp such limits. They are contentless, and hence provide absolutely nothing for our awareness. And he goes on to say some interesting things later with regard to Bertrand Russell and taking out life insurance and things like that. We have a very bare awareness of, let's say, a formal, contentless awareness of death as a limit that we're going to approach. But when we think of death in a more substantive way, what we're actually thinking of, he says, is not death itself, but the effects of death. We can imagine our own. We can't imagine being dead. That's not something that's possible to imagine. But we can imagine our corpses. We cannot imagine being dead, but we can imagine the fate of our loved ones left behind. That's why we do certain things like buy life insurance or other provisions. And we can think of those sort of things, but we shouldn't imagine that we're thinking of death when we think of those things. We're not thinking of our own deaths, which are something that is kind of impossible to think of except as a limit that we're approaching. We're thinking of the results of our deaths.